Chapter 10 Rumpelstiltkin's Debt. Pinocchio Prison was home of the most dangerous criminals in all the kingdom. It was a tall, dark fortress that sat in the center of a long peninsula that covered around the Mermaid Bay, in the southern part of the Eastern Kingdom. It was perched at the top of a high and rocky cliff with sharp spikes pointing inward and outward at every window, so there was no possible way to escape or gain unauthorized entry. Enchanted wooden soldiers patrolled the narrow stone halls, keeping watch of the lawbreakers behind bars. The majority of those locked away were typical sheep-stealing ogres, kidnapping witches, and man-eating animals had been caught before they fled into the dwarf forest. The prison was also the home of a great mystery. During the 100-year sleeping curse that the entire of the Eastern Kingdom had endured, the prison had been the only place in the kingdom that had been spared. All the soldiers and inmates inside had strangely remained conscious while the rest of the country had slumbered. More recently, the mystery had developed when the prison also became the only place in the kingdom not covered in the Enchantress domestic thorn bush and vines. Whether it was a fluke or a miracle was the question. Many assumed the prison was just too far removed to be affected by the curse. However, unbeknownst to all the soldiers and inmates inside, the prison's exclusion from the kingdom's greatest woes was due to a high-profile prisoner who resided on the 13th floor. Rumpelstiltkin was still serving his 127th year behind bars. He was a very small man with large, baggy eyes, a button nose, and short hair that clung to his head like a helmet. He wore a large collared shirt, tight pants on his tiny legs, and pointed red shoes that jingled when he walked. After his infamous failed attempt to take the firstborn child of the Eastern Kingdom's former queen, Rumpelstiltkin went into hiding. But after a few years of being at large, the small man couldn't live with the guilt of what he had almost done. So 127 years ago, he decided to turn himself in and had lived in the Pinocchio prison ever since. Rumpelstiltkin had a tiny chamber all to himself. He had 2 barred windows, one on the heavy door of his cell and under the wall facing Mermaid Bay. Both were too high for him to see out of his useless unless he jumped, so the dark stones of his chamber floor and the walls were all he had to look at every day. His life had simplified greatly well in prison. He slept on a large stack of hay in the corner and a tiny table pushed to the side with only 1 spoon and a bowl in his possession. Although Rumpelstiltkin had many magical capabilities, he had decided to give them up when he went to prison. Fear magic would only lead him to trouble. He kept his quarters as simple as possible. The first decade or so of imprisonment was incredibly lonely for the little man, but luckily for him, an unexpected roommate eventually moved in. One day, a strong ocean breeze blew a seed into his chamber, and a week later, a small daisy began to grow in between 2 rocks of the stone floor. Rumpelstiltkin was amazed such a thing could happen. How could something so pleasant grow in such a miserable place? Of all locations in the world, why did it decide to land here? He pondered the question for a great while, glad of something to distract him from his solitude and shame. He ultimately decided the flower must have needed a friend as much as he did, and that its presence in his cell had been purposeful. He took great care of the flower, impressively keeping it alive the entire time he had been in the prison. He shared his water with the daisy. He told it stories, and when it fell ill, he would stand on its tiptoes by the window with his spoon and reflect the sunlight toward it until it regained its strength. The average person having a flower as a companion may have seemed a little odd, but to Rumpelstiltkin it was the best friend he had ever had. The flower never mocked him for the clothes he wore, like others had in the past. The flower never judged him for wanting the most out of life. The flower never used him for political gain. The flower never condemned him for the mistakes he made years before. The flower was only capable of doing one thing, sharing its beauty. In a way, life in prison had been the best thing that ever happened to Rumpelstiltkin, given the most meaningful relationship he had ever had. However, His self-surrender had only been a way for him to clear his conscience. It was also a way for him to protect himself from alliances he had made in the past, and unfortunately, he had spent a long hiding from the past. His past eventually found him. It was just before sunset when a thunderous noise was heard outside the prison. It was an intense combination of snapping and crunching and popping that became louder and louder by the second. The prison began to shake. His bowl and spoon rattled on the table. Whatever it was getting closer. Rumpelstiltskin jumped up and down at his window, trying to see what was causing the commotion. What he saw was the most terrifying sight he had seen in years. Like an enormous earthy stampede, a tsunami of angry thorn bushes and vines traveled across the land, growing in the prison's directions. "Oh no," Rumpelstiltskin gasped. He clasped his hand around his mouth and looked around the cell. There was only one person capable of such magic, and after 127 years he knew she had finally come for him. The wooden soldiers rushed through the halls in panic. "Thorn bushes and vines are headed for the prison!" one shouted. "Prepare for an attack!" another yelled. Rumpelstiltskin looked down at the daisy. It was quivering. "There, little flower," he said, and gently stroked one of its leaves. "Everything is going to be all right. I'm going to hide you." He quickly retrieved his bowl off the table and covered his friend with it. The prison was hit by the plants, and the impact made the whole fortress sway. The thorn bushes and vines crawled up the sides of the structure, wrapping it around like an army of serpents until all the windows were covered and the prison went dim inside. After a few quiet moments, a series of soft rumbles pulsed through the prison like a giant heartbeat. Each rumble was stronger than the next and came from several floors below Rumpelstiltskin's cell. Something was slowly making its way higher and higher through the prison. Rumpelstiltskin could hear all the wooden soldiers from above rushing down to fight off whatever was intruding below. The clanking of their weapons echoed as they tried fighting it off. They were definitely fighting off more than just plants. Finally, Rumpelstiltskin heard the battle reach the 13th floor. He was too scared to move. He smelled things burning, and smoke started to flow into his cell under his cell door. Each soldier's screams was followed by a loud thud as the wooden bodies hit the floor, one by one. Once the soldiers were gone, a pair of soft footsteps came down the hall and stopped at Rumpelstiltskin's cell door. He was trembling, afraid these were his last moments alive. A bright flash of violet light blasted the cell door into smithereens. Rumpelstiltskin braced himself and was pelted by the debris. Once the smoke from the blast cleared, he finally saw who had been causing all the chaos. Standing in the doorway of his cell was a tall and beautiful woman. She had long magenta hair that flowed and rippled above her like slow-moving flames. Her eyes were violet with long feathered eyelashes like moths and antennas. She wore a long purple gown with matching gloves and a high collar. A ghostly cape flowed around her through the hall like a thick sheet of smoke. "Is Mia?" Rumpelstiltskin said in horror. The Enchantress' bright red lips curved into a smirk. "Hello, Rumpy," Ismia said in her playful, airy voice. "How I've missed you." Ismia stepped into Rumpelstiltskin's cell and examined the small chamber. Vines and thorn bushes followed her, growing around the walls of the cell, covering the inside of the prison as she traveled through it. "I love what you've done with the place," Ismia said sarcastically, passing the stack of hay he used as a bed. "It doesn't fit a man of your adequate taste, though, doesn't it? I can't imagine why you abandoned me to spend 13 decades in here." Rumpelstiltskin remained very still, knowing it wasn't wise to make sudden movements around dangerous creatures. "Have you come to kill me?" he said with a quivering jaw. The Enchantress forced out a theatrical laugh that did little to comfort him. "Why would I want to kill my oldest friend?" she said with a menacing smile. "Besides, if I wanted you dead, I would have killed you ages ago." Her smile faded and her violet eyes glared down at him. "Well, do you think I've spared you from all the curses I've cast over the kingdom so far?" Rumpelstiltskin had always wondered if the expectations were because of him. "If you aren't going to kill me, Then what brings you here? He asked, trembling even more. He was convinced she must have had a fate worse than that planned for him. Look at you, Rumpy. You're just as helpless as the day I found you, Ismia said pityingly. When we met, you were just another miserable dwarf working in the mines, but I knew were kindred spirits. But we both wanted more than the world was offering us. We both were ostracized because of it. I never meant to anger you, Rumpelstiltskin said, and lowered his head. I had to turn myself in. I couldn't live with what I've done. Or what you failed to do, that is, Ismia said. But all is forgiven. Rumpelstiltskin knew her too well to believe her. Ismia had something up her sleeve. She always did. What do you want from me? He asked. Ismia went to the window. The vines and thorn bushes covering the outside parted so she could see the view of the bay. Like it or not, we made a deal, she said. I've come back so you can finally fulfill your end of our bargain. I saved you from a melancholy life in the mines. I made you my apprentice and taught you magic, and all I ever asked in exchange was for your assistance. You never said I would have to kidnap a child, Rumpelstiltskin, and a princess, no less. I made it incredibly easy for you, Ismia said sharply, her tone grown angry. I bewitched the king into thinking he needed a wife who could spin hay into gold. I chose the village girl he ordered to do so. I planned the whole negotiation between the two of you, and all you had to do was take the child that was owned to you. You wanted me to do your dirty work, Rumpelstiltskin peeped. You wanted my name to be tarnished if anything went wrong. Of course I did, she said unapologetically. I was still in the happily ever after assembly at the time. I couldn't get caught stealing an infant princess. As far as the fairies knew, I was still one of them. As far as I knew, you're still one of them too, Rumpelstiltskin said. I thought I was going to be the apprentice of a great fairy, not an enchantress who was secretly plotting to take over the world. Ismia took delight in remembering this deception. Yes, everyone was surprised, she said. Of course, that all changed when the rest of the fairies found out you were working for me, and I wasn't invited to the child's christening. I lost my temper and was cursed the whole kingdom to die. They would have too if the fairy godmother had converted my curse into a pathetic sleeping curse. The enchantress closed her eyes and massaged the side of her head. And since then, Sleeping Beauty has been my own personal nightmare, she said. You should have seen her face when I attacked her in the forest, though. There she was, the Material Queen, trembling with fear. It was priceless. Ismia smiled to herself and let out a chuckle. You wanted me to kidnap her when she was a baby. Then you cursed her for 100 years, and now you're covered her kingdom in vines and thorns, Rumpelstiltskin. Why do you hate Queen Sleeping Beauty so much? Ismia glanced at him sideways as she completed her honest answer, the answer she would give him. Whatever she said, there was always much more she wasn't saying. That's where everyone gets it wrong, Ismia said. I'll admit it, I take great satisfaction in seeing the Eastern Kingdom in a state of turmoil. My reputation was bruised when my fatal spell was reduced to an extensive nap. So, there is an element of revenge I take great pleasure in. But the reason I attacked the Eastern Kingdom again has nothing to do with Queen Sleeping Beauty. And why are you causing all this chaos? Rumpelstiltskin asked, nervously looking at the vines and thorn bushes outside. Everything has its purpose, Ismia said, with a proud and sinister gleam in her eyes. It's been so long since my last public appearance. The world thought I was dead. I needed to show them that I was back and more powerful than ever. And when better day than a day that we're celebrating the end of my last curse. It's deliciously evil of me, isn't it? Ismia closed her eyes, and a wide smile grew on her face. What part of our bargain do you want me to fulfill? Rumpelstiltskin asked. Surely you don't want me to kidnap Queen Sleeping Beauty now. It was never Sleeping Beauty that I was after, Ismia said, and angrily paced around the chamber. Sleeping Beauty, this, Sleeping Beauty, that. Sleeping Beauty this, Sleeping Beauty that. She wouldn't even have that ridiculous name if it wasn't for me. This puzzled Rumpelstiltskin even more. Then what are you after? He asked. I was after a child, Ismia confessed. A child of royal blood, specifically. It's one of the many things I needed to complete a special project I've been working on. A special project, he asked. You mean taking over the world, I assume? That's what you always want, isn't it? Ismia looked him straight in the eyes. Something like that, she said. It's a lot harder than it looks. Shortly before I met you, I figured out a way to do it. It's an enchantment of sorts. It's a very complex formula that requires certain properties to be claimed and special assets to obtain. Once I manage to gather all of them together, not even the fairy godmother herself can stop me. It's been more than a century since I last saw you, Rumplestiltkin said. Why have you decided to strike now after all this time? Ismia waved a hand, and the stones of the floor rose from the large chair. You haven't been around, Rumpy, Ismia said, and took a seat. While you've been locked away, I have had quite the century. It's not as if I've been lying around this whole time. I've been betrayed. I've been poisoned. I've been back from the verge of death, stronger and more powerful than ever. Poisoned, Rumpelstiltskin said. By whom? Evilly, Ismia said, the name as if it were disease. Evilly, Rumpelstiltskin said. Who is that? She was supposed to be my solution, Ismia said. However, she ended up being my greatest disappointment. She waved her hand again, and stones of the floor formed a stool for Rumpelstiltskin to sit on. It's a long story, so have a seat, Ismia ordered. Rumpelstiltskin didn't argue. After I cursed the Eastern Kingdom, I went to hiding, Ismia explained. I may have been the most powerful fairy in the world, but that was no match for all the other fairies put together. I knew I couldn't strike again until I was further along with my project, until I was past the point of no return, so I plotted in secret, keeping a watchful eye on all the kingdoms for the pieces I needed to continue my work. I assembled a quaint little castle in the northeast where no one could find me, and plotted out what my next move would be. But it required so many elements outside my reach, I knew I would have to be patient. I brought many troubled souls into the castle, hoping to produce a proper apprentice. But they all failed me, each being bigger disappointed than the last. Many years later in the Charming Kingdom, when the late King Chester was just the prince, the palace had an unexpected visitor one night. A young maiden banged on the palace doors, seeking shelter from a horrible rainstorm. Chester instantly fell in love with her and asked his parents for permission to propose. Being the old-fashioned king and queen they were, Chester's parents said he could only marry the maiden if he could prove his way she was royal blood. The prince devised a plan to test the maiden's royal status. He made her a bed in the guest chambers with a stack of dozen mattresses and placed a pea on the very bottom, convincing his parents that only a royal could feel the imperfections through the mattress. The next morning, the man complained about the restless night, and Chester was certain he had found his future wife. He asked for the maiden's hand in marriage, but she refused his proposal. The maiden had a secret. She had tossed and turned with comfort all night because she was pregnant, not because she was a princess. The maiden had been a simple peasant runaway, embarrassed to be a child without a wedlock. She disappeared from the palace as quickly as she came, and Prince Chester never saw her again. Naturally, when I heard about this so-called pregnant princess on the run, I was intrigued, knowing I needed a royal child. I tracked her down in the forest, where she was living on her own in a cave. To my delight, she was very much with child when I discovered her. I made her an offer she couldn't refuse. In exchange for a child, I would give her a life of riches and luxuries beyond her wildest dreams. The usual. She agreed, and the deal was made. Unfortunately, she backed out of her agreement shortly before giving birth to the child. She ran into a neighboring village and died giving birth to a little girl, whom the villagers named Evilly. I soon discovered that the maiden hadn't been a royal, and Evilly couldn't be the child I needed. I let the villagers raise her while I conceived another plan to get use out of Evilly after all. I was going to train her to seduce and marry Prince White of the Northern Kingdom. Together they would produce an heir, and I would finally have a child of royal blood that I desired. Unfortunately, when I returned for Evilly in her adolescence, She had fallen in love with one of the village boys, a pathetic aspiring poet by the name of Myra. I took Evely to my castle in the northeast to begin training. All she did was cry and whine every day and night about how much she missed Myra. So I brought the boy to her, imprisoning him inside a magic mirror. I thought it had been a kind gesture on my part, but only caused Evely to grow more spiteful. She conducted a plan of her own against me. She broke into my room of potions and conducted a poison so strong that when a few drops touched the ground outside her window, all the trees and plants for miles around were killed. Evely laced a small dagger with the poison and stabbed me with it. The poison almost killed me. I shriveled down to the state of decaying human. I lost my power, all my beauty, and all hope that I would fulfill my plans for the future. I ran as far as I could, fearing Evely would try to fetch me off, but the stupid girl was so consumed trying to free Myra, she forgot all about me. An old witch named Hegatha found me in the woods, barely alive. She recognized me and the effects of the poison. She brought me to her small hut in the dwarf forest and nursed me back to health. I became her apprentice, but she treated me horribly, taking advantage of the person I once was. She sent me out in the most gruesome areas and forced me to sleep outside like an animal. Ironically, the poison is also what saved me. The happily ever afters simply have been looking for me since I cursed the Eastern Kingdom. They didn't recognize me in my frail state, and I decided I was dead. But one day, a few decades later, Hagatha and I were collecting plants from the thornbush pit and that she planted around her hut. She was forcing me to do all the work, and my hands were scraped and scratched from all the thorns. I remember feeling more angry than I ever had felt in my life. I was furious that I, the woman who had once been more powerful than anyone else, had become a witch's slave. And with this anger, I felt something different. Suddenly, I felt alive again, like a candle had been relit inside of me. After many long years, my body had finally recovered from the effects of the poison, and my powers had came back. It's true what they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm living proof. I was more powerful than ever before. My powers were different too. My magic had always become from a happily ever after source, coming from a life among fairies. That's why every curse I created could be broken with a kiss or a token of affection, but not anymore. This time, my magic had no limits. I pushed Hagatha into the pit and cursed the vines and thorn bushes, trapped anything that came close to it, as Mia confessed. You pushed her into the thorn bush pit, Rumpelstiltkin asked. All this time it's been your magic festering in that godless place? Indeed, the Enchantress said with a boastful shrug. Believe me, I wanted to take credit for it, but I still had work to do before I went public again. I returned to the castle and collected all my belongings, ready to complete what I had started so long ago. But I knew that I would have to continue being patient. The kingdoms were experiencing a golden age. Cinderella and Prince Charming were married. Sleeping Beauty had just awoken. Snow White was crowned queen. I knew if I waited until the right moment, my return would have a much bigger impact, and I know it has. And now it has. Rumpelstiltkin feared what her newfound strength would mean for the future of the kingdoms. I never understood you, he said. You used to be so admired and loved by the whole world. Why wasn't that enough? When did it all go wrong? The Enchantress looked to the floor with a snide expression. People only love you as long as they're getting something out of you. But the minute they say something they don't want to hear or do something they don't want to see, all the admiration drains from their hearts. But why this obsession with power? Rumpelstiltkin asked, as cautiously as possible. Why do you need the world, Esmea? Esmea let out a long sigh. I have my reasons, she said sharply, and quite frankly, I don't give a damn if you or anyone else understands. A tension grew in the room, but it wasn't between Esmea and Rumpelstiltskin. It was between Esmea and the world. But where do I fit in? Rumpelstiltskin asked. If you're so powerful now, why do you need me? Why, that's simple, Esmea said. Out of all my apprentices over the years, you have been the most loyal to me, Rumpy. You actually started what I asked of you, and now I'm going to let you finish it. Besides, it would be nice to have a friend around once I take over." They exchanged a witty glance, both aware that this was nothing close to a friendship. "There's another child, isn't there?" Rumpelstiltskin asked, with a heavy heart, already knowing the answer. "You want me to kidnap another child?" "Precisely," the Enchantress said. Rumpelstiltskin lowered his head and closed his eyes. He knew he wouldn't have a choice this time. Refusal would mean death. "Well, that's enough catching up for one day," Ismia said, and glided toward the door with the newfound spring in her step. "Come along, Rumpy, there's much work to be done. I've waited almost 2 centuries for this, and as you can imagine, I've grown very impatient." The stone sank back into the ground, and Rumpelstiltskin fell on his behind. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Hagatha's old hut," the Enchantress said. "It's where I've been spending most of my time since my castle was destroyed about a year ago. You should see what I've done with the place. A little magic goes a long way in the dwarf forest." Rumpelstiltskin methodically looked around at his tiny cell, and had never seen so much like home until he was being forced to leave it. "I just have to say goodbye," Rumpelstiltskin said sadly. Esme raised an eyebrow, not knowing who on earth he was talking about. Perhaps prison had been harder on her small friend than she imagined. Rumpelstiltskin got on the floor, took the bowl off the daisy. "I have to go now," he said, fighting back tears. "Please don't look at me like that. You'll be all right." He lightly stroked one of the white petals. "Goodbye, little flower. Please take care of yourself." Rumpelstiltskin stood and walked through the doorway, leaving his cell for the first time in 127 years, but stepped into a world of even harsher imprisonment. Ismia lingered in the doorway, glaring down at the flower. She couldn't believe something so small and inferior could be so important, so protected, or so loved. It ignited a fire inside of her. The Enchantress waved a hand in its direction, and the daisy withered away, crumbled into bits of nothing. A smile appeared on her face, so satisfied to destroy something even so small. Alright, that is the end of chapter 10. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more of The Land of Stories, The Enchantress Returns, and more books in the future. Also, if you want to hear any other books later on, don't forget to comment in the videos at the bottom. And I hope you enjoy the reading.